My best friend Heather was the most interesting and altogether craziest person I'd ever met. So in the summer of 1986, when she asked if I wanted to go and reanimate a dead body, I said sure, no problem. Little did I know what I was getting myself in for. We arrived at the cemetery at 11 p.m., and our friend Glenn met us there. He was into all things creepy, and Heather knew that he'd never tell anyone. We watched as the evening guard locked the gates, and then drove off in his Pinto, giving us the all clear. It was now or never, and we scaled the fence with ease, as the parts that were supposed to be sharp were not anymore, and I'd brought a thick blanket to cover them with as we climbed over. Before I knew it, we were inside, and there was nobody around, apart from us and 1,000 dead bodies. Heather said that for the ritual to work, it was best for us to pick a grave that looked relatively new. This took a while, as most of them seemed to be from the 50s or before, and we covered a lot of ground before we eventually found one that belonged to an Edward Stanley, who passed away in 1984, aged 56. Heather smiled. She was excited that we were actually getting somewhere, and Glenn held her bag open as she took out a few items and placed them on top of the tombstone. I, on the other hand, started to feel a little strange at this point, and the reality of what we were doing really hit home. Heather was busy lighting a candle when she glanced up and saw that I was nervous. She stopped what she was doing and said to me that it was perfectly normal to be apprehensive, as it wasn't like we were going for a stroll around the block, which made me feel better. Glenn said that he'd found the correct passage in Heather's leather-bound book, which was titled The Dance of the Dead Eyes, and Heather took it from him, telling me that we were about to make history. She slowly looked at Glenn, then me, and asked if we were ready, then Heather kneeled down, signaling for us to copy her. She cleared her throat and began to recite something that sounded like pure evil. It was only a few sentences long, but I'll never forget how those words made me feel. Afterwards, she blew out the candle and closed the book. I asked what we were supposed to do, and she said to wait. An hour came and went, and we started to get really bored, so took it in turns for one of us to go for a walk, while the other two stood by Edward's grave, waiting for something to happen. When it was my turn, I walked the entire perimeter and kept a watch out for anybody coming. I'd known Heather since we were kids, and had tried plenty of supernatural games before, but none of them worked, although the instructions usually got very muddled along the way. It was Heather's scream. I turned around and ran back to Edward's grave, where I saw it. A decomposing figure, who I can only imagine was Edward Stanley, stood hunched over, then slowly stood up, growling at the night sky. A hand quickly grabbed mine and pulled me behind a bush, and I was relieved to see that it was Heather's. She was huddled together with Glenn, and pointed in the direction of Edward, then whispered that we did it. The most important scientific discovery of the 20th century belonged to us. Glenn asked where she purchased the book, and Heather replied that she took it from her grandmother. We all watched as Edward paced around, occasionally stumbling on the mounds of dirt that he'd created in getting out of his grave. It was very dark, so hard to see properly, but his face looked twisted and rotten, and the eyes were whited out. He seemed pent up, and like he was searching for something. It all seemed like a dream to me, like it wasn't real life at all. Zombies didn't exist in real life. I was about to ask what on earth we should do, when I heard a commotion from beside us. At first I thought somebody was digging, but I couldn't see anybody around, apart from us and Edward. Heather, Glenn, and I all looked at each other in a mixture of panic and curiosity when a hand burst through a nearby grave, and the smell hit us quick. Seconds later, another hand emerged from another grave, and Heather shouted that there was only supposed to be one. I stood on my tiptoes and looked out over the cemetery. In every grave, hands and bodies were bursting through the dirt. There were hundreds of them, if not thousands. They were snarling and biting each other. I knew that if they reached us, then we would be done for. Heather and I scrambled for a small tree that was about 20 feet away. I yelled for Glenn, but he seemed almost hypnotized by the zombies. Heather grabbed my hand as I shouted for a second time, but he just wasn't listening. She helped me as I grabbed the lower branch and pulled myself up, then I reached down and took her hand. Heather managed to get up just as they came for her. We were out of their reach, but only just. Maybe 8 or 9 feet off the ground. I took a breath and pulled my feet up as they swarmed the area. Heather turned to me and said that we were safe, and I thanked her for her quick thinking, but Glenn was still down there somewhere. It took a few moments to pinpoint him. He was hiding behind a grave, low to the ground, and he looked terrified. I tried to keep my voice low, but shouted to him to get up a tree. He nodded, and Heather broke off a small branch, ready to distract them. We said to run after 3, 2, 1. Heather threw the branch and we shouted as loud as we could. Glenn ran to a tree not far from where he was, but he didn't make it. There were too many of them, and they cut him off, then quickly surrounded him. For a few seconds, they circled as he lay there on the ground, curled up in a ball. They snarled and growled, and then they pounced. It was a horrific attack, and Heather covered my ears as Glenn screamed for us to help him. She winced and shook her head until it was over, and they slowly dispersed, scattering all over the cemetery. Heather kept whispering that we shouldn't have come here, and I tried my best to slow my heart rate. I asked what the time was, hoping that it would be at least 3 or 4 in the morning, but it was just after 1. My whole body was numb, and I felt like I was drunk. I'd never been in shock before, and it felt exactly like everybody said it would. I kept seeing Glenn's face, how scared he was, and I was sure that those screams would stay with me forever. I turned to Heather for comfort, but she was fixated on something not too far away. I asked her what she was staring at, and she replied that the cemetery gates would open at 6, which was less than 5 hours away. And if the gatekeeper failed to see the zombie herd, then they would escape and spread out to the surrounding areas in no time at all. She then said that she could see the book laying on the ground, and there was a reverse spell in there. She dropped it in all the panic, but it was our best shot. The only problem was that it was 20 feet away, and on the ground, where the flesh-eating zombies were. The plan was simple. I had a packet of Mentos in my pocket, and Heather had half a bottle of Coke on her. She was the fastest of the two of us, but I had a stronger throw. We hoped that it would provide enough of a distraction for her to get that damned book. I took the cap off the Coke bottle, poured in the Mentos, and threw it as far as I could. The foamy explosion was surprisingly large and loud, which was what we wanted. The zombies stared, then slowly headed towards it. Heather wasted no time in getting down from the tree, and kept low as she darted towards the book. She picked it up and ran back, dodging one of the undead as she neared the tree. I helped her back up, and we both grinned that our plan had worked, although she had caught the attention of some of the zombies that were headed our way. Her hands were shaking as she flipped through the pages, but she found the passage that had created all of this, and on the opposite page was the reverse spell. She took a deep breath and said the words loud and clear, reciting the entire thing. The zombies stopped momentarily, and a small gust of wind blew through the cemetery, but then they carried on moving towards us. Heather shouted out that they were meant to stop, and I told her to try again. She repeated the words, but nothing happened. My heart sank, and we sat back on the branches, thoroughly deflated. I didn't know if it was the spell or not, but the herds were really congregating around us now. We put our feet up as much as possible, but the zombies were aware that we were up there, and they hadn't been before. They were reaching up, trying to get us, and I couldn't stop thinking about how Glenn ended up. Heather wrapped her arms around me as we both quietly cried, and that's when I heard the snap. The branch that we were sitting on was beginning to break, due to the weight of us. I fell off balance, but managed to steady myself. There was nowhere left to go, and more zombies were headed our way. Heather looked out over the herd and placed her head against the tree trunk, then she took something out her pocket, scribbled something on it with a pen, and handed it to me. I was about to ask what it was, but she shook her head and told me to wait for it to clear, then run. Heather suddenly leaped off the branch and landed in the massive zombies on the ground, but kicked and punched her way free, and ran. She shouted and screamed as they followed her in the other direction, away from the tree, and away from me. I waited until the last of them left the area, and jumped down from the tree. As I did so, the branch collapsed onto the ground. The back wall of the cemetery was about 50 or 60 feet away, and I ran with all my might in that direction. The fence itself was about 8 feet tall, and with pure adrenaline, I managed to scale it and landed safely on the other side. I took a moment to take in the fact that I was free when I felt a hand grab my hair and pulled me quickly towards the metal fence, where I felt a moment of intense pain around the temple and then fell into a deep sleep. The first thing that I noticed when I woke up was the bright sunlight. I was vaguely aware of a growling sound beside me, and when I looked round, I saw a zombie that was trying to get at me, but it couldn't. That was probably the one that knocked me out, but luckily I must have fallen in a way that it couldn't reach. I slowly stood up and felt my head throb, then began to walk. Despite the pain, it felt good to see daylight again and walk the streets even if they were deserted. There was a strong smell of burning, and a fire engine zoomed past me with its sirens blazing. I told myself that the gates were still locked, the zombies were contained, and Heather had made it out alive, but as I turned the corner, my hopes were quickly shattered. It was like something from a disaster movie. People were fleeing their homes, and cars were on fire. I saw mothers and children hiding in phone boxes, unsure what to do, and bodies were on the ground. All I could do was keep walking and know that we had caused all of this. The zombies that we reanimated had freed themselves. Now dead and dying people lay all over the floor, just like Glenn. Glenn, who was so scared that he didn't even put up a fight. I didn't even know what part of town this was, and even though people were shouting at me to get off the sidewalk, I just kept going, and on my journey I learned that the other cemeteries had been affected too. There were so many of them, and by some sick joke, they left me alone. Eventually a paramedic took pity on me and I ended up in the back of an ambulance, heading for the nearest hospital. I didn't deserve that. I should have turned myself in to the police instead. The hospital was overly busy, and they kept referring to the zombie outbreak as the situation. I tried to tell the nurse about the book and what we had done, but she took a look at my forehead and thought that I was concussed, so they referred me to another section to wait for another doctor. While I was waiting there, I felt something in my pocket, and I remembered that Heather had given me something before she jumped. It was a crumpled photo of Heather and me when we were kids. On the back of it, she had written "Forgive me." Heather had given her life to save mine, but many other people had died because of what we did. The book was still out there, and maybe, just maybe, some scholar or occult academic might be able to do what we couldn't and reverse the spell. I stood up and took a broom from the janitor's cupboard, snapping off the top, and walked out of the hospital. I was ready to head back to the graveyard and get that damned book, maybe taking out 1 or 2 zombies along the way.